Well, hi everyone. I'm continuing to do update videos on this Teton Pass embankment failure of the roadway. And I know a lot of you have reached out to me through private channels expressing support and concurrence with a lot of what I've said. I've also had more than a few detractors. That's okay. I'm going to give you an update on what's been happening, the news that's come out from Wyoming DOT, as well as from local media sources. And also I'm going to explain to you what the technical basis of many of my concerns for what is being done here for both temporary and perhaps long-term measures as well. In this video, I'm going to give you an update on some quotes from key players as it's been reported. I'm also going to go through a list of questions that I have regarding this project. Now, I've raised some of these questions in previous videos, but I think it's important to distill these questions. And if you have an opportunity as part of the local media, or if there's any public meetings, which I don't think have happened to date, please consider asking some version and some combination of these questions. You know, I've submitted many of these types of questions to Wyoming DOT directly, and they haven't responded. And that's been well over a week at this point. So as Ronald Reagan used to say,
the maxim is, dovii no provii, trust but verify.
Trust but verify. And I think it's okay to trust your state officials when it comes to implementing a repair. I think it's fair to trust them that they have the best intentions and the best interests in mind. But I think you have to verify whether what they're doing is appropriate and reasonable. And I think a lot of my questioning started with their apparent lack of appreciation for the pending failure of that embankment catastrophically that occurred late Friday, June 7th, or early in the morning of June 8th on Saturday. But let's go over some of my questions. First, why hasn't Wyoming DOT computed the factor of safety anticipated for the reconfigured embankment that will be used for the bypass roadway? This is a biggie, and this came from a recent article that I'll cite here in a second. What minimum factor of safety would they consider to be acceptable? What geotechnical data do they have from past and current or ongoing studies with which to confirm the stability of the reconfigured roadway embankment for the temporary bypass? What geotechnical information is still pending in terms of instrumentation data, laboratory tests associated with soil samples obtained in the field, and the associated analysis, and when will that pending data be compiled? Has Wyoming DOT consulted with private sector engineers in implementing either the temporary or planned permanent repair measures for the roadway embankment? If Wyoming DOT had an inclinometer casing installed in or near the portion of the embankment last year, as has been recently reported by Jackson Hole News and Guide, where specifically was it located and when was it surveyed following its installation? What were the depths and magnitude of slope movement over the period of time prior to the catastrophic slope failure as indicated from the inclinometer readings? What is the type and location of any geotechnical instrumentation that will be installed to monitor the reconfigured slope, and how often will that instrumentation data be collected and analyzed? Wyoming DOT has indicated that based upon current projections, the roadway for the temporary bypass is anticipated to be open on or around June 26, 2024. Given that timeline, will there be sufficient time to install the geotechnical instrumentation for slope and foundation soil monitoring and to have collected enough initial readings to establish baseline conditions and to determine whether movement is continuing with the foundation soils or the embankment? So that timeline puts completion of this bypass and reopening to traffic as early as a week from the date of this recording, so around June 26th. Now they also have to complete stabilization of the mud flow areas a few miles away, and I'll touch on that here in a bit. What restrictions will be placed on traffic for the temporary bypass in terms of size and weight of permissible vehicles? Will it be permissible to tow a trailer while traveling over the temporary bypass roadway? How long will the bypass roadway be in use? What specifically are the plans for a permanent repair to this section of roadway embankment? When will this permanent repair work be started and completed? Will it be necessary to close traffic on the Teton Pass Highway 22 while the permanent embankment slope repairs are being made? And finally, as it appears that Wyoming DOT staff did not anticipate that the catastrophic failure was going to occur for the roadway embankment late on June 7th or early June 8th, what assurances can they provide to the public that if future slope movement were to occur, that they would be both detected and appropriately evaluated? So in my mind, I think those are all fair technical questions. And in the reporting I've seen so far, Wyoming DOT hasn't either addressed them or has not addressed them in any sufficient detail to provide an understanding of what their decision-making process is and what it's based on. Now, I sent many of these key questions to Governor Gordon of Wyoming. We'll wait to see if he responds, but I am concerned with what's going on, and I would like to see Wyoming DOT address these questions. These are fair technical questions, as I said, in my opinion. Now, a few of you, in an indirect way, I suppose, was trying to discredit me because I mispronounced the name of a landslide that occurred in 2014 near the Walgreens, which has since been demolished and removed. And I think I pronounced it Gross Venture. And many of you reached out and said the pronunciation is Grovant. But actually, given that it's a French word, here's the proper pronunciation.
Gros ventre.
And I'm sure that's not how it's pronounced locally, which is fine. I've lived in many places that had Spanish or French place names, and the locals insist on pronouncing it differently than it would have been in the native language for the source of that place name. So, for example, I lived in Austin, Texas, and there's a San Jacinto, as they say. And if you say San Jacinto, people will correct you. There's a Versailles in Missouri, but it's pronounced Versailles, Missouri. At any rate, let's continue on. Now, there's a really good article that came out this morning from Jackson Hole News and Guide. This was written by Billy Arnold. I'll put a link to this article in the description for this video. Also, most of the photos and video that you see associated with the status of the landslide repair has come from Wyoming DOT, either their media site or through their YouTube channel. So I'll put links to those resources in the description to this video as well. But this article by Billy Arnold, I've got a couple of places where I've been quoted here because Mr. Arnold interviewed me yesterday to get my input on a couple of things. But there's a number of interesting quotes and circumstances that jump out to me based on this article. It says here, but in Jackson, across the country, politicians and geotechnical engineers, the folks responsible for manipulating dirt for human benefit, I really do wish they'd say soil, are raising questions about Wyoming DOT's plans for the temporary bypass. They're asking whether safety is being compromised for speed. And by the way, Wyoming DOT has been referring to this as dirt work, and it's a colloquial term. But there is a difference between soil and dirt that just sticks in my head since college days. And the professor said the difference was dirt's what's under your fingernails. Other geotechnical engineers and landslide experts say building a temporary road section quickly isn't abnormal. Still, with concerns about stability in the area, those engineers want more information about Wyoming DOT's plans. And that's what I've been making several videos about. They're hesitant to opine on the department's work without seeing more. WyDOT has not publicly released a formal plan for the bypass by press time Tuesday. In the absence of information, people are speculating. And I got some contacts from people who were upset. They thought I was speculating too much. And I think they misunderstand that my concerns that I've raised in these previous videos is based on fundamental engineering principles. I'm not trying to tell them in detail whether what they're doing is correct or incorrect. What I'm saying is if they follow typical practice in geotechnical engineering for the construction, well, in this case, for the design and construction of a roadway embankment, there's certain procedures that have been established for decades that, given the short time frame for the reconstruction of this bypass, there's no way they could have fully addressed these concerns or the fundamental engineering aspects that go into these sorts of design and construction projects. And I'm going to give you some really key examples that came out of this article that I think are truly red flags and corroborates my initial concerns that I've had about this whole episode. Now, about the only engineer who has practiced in that area, I don't know where he's based, but he consulted on that previous Walgreens landslide, is George McConn. And again, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly. We have this quote here from him. "People do need to know," said George McConn, an engineer and expert in landslides who has worked with Wyoming DOT for years and consulted for the town of Jackson officials, responded to the mudslide in 2014. "Some people may be averse to talking in public or try to avoid it like the plague," McConn said, "but I can see it would benefit the DOT if they would share what they know with the public." Now, I will say Wyoming DOT, and I commend them for this, has made themselves available for press interviews, either on camera or over the phone. But yet, with all of these interviews, they haven't really addressed key technical questions, in my opinion. Hammond, and this is Bob Hammond, the District 3 engineer for Wyoming DOT, who's heading up this construction of the bypass. Hammond, meanwhile, said a public meeting is a good idea. The problem is time. Wyoming DOT is focused on the rebuild, and organizing a meeting would be onerous. Well, they could send out a press release, and I think their press releases from a technical standpoint have been wholly inadequate. One of the early press releases from Wyoming DOT indicated that they were removing the asphalt pavement in order to reduce the driving forces on the failed portion of the embankment slope. Now that makes absolutely no sense, as I pointed out previously. A few inches of asphalt isn't going to affect the movement of this slide area one bit. He has also implored the public to trust the engineers on the ground. While onlookers are asking many valid questions, they're not seeing all the information that he and other Wyoming DOT geologists are, Hammond said. Okay, well, I don't know why he can't very simply articulate what that information is. But again, his timelines don't really make a lot of sense to people like me who are familiar with conducting geotechnical investigations and using that information for a basis of designs for embankments. There's a lot of people who don't know what we're building up here, and a lot of people who really want to know, he said, but it's one of those things where you can't explain it to everybody all the time. How about explaining it to a few people once and let them disseminate the information? Now, locally, Jackson Town Councilor Jessica Chambers has been questioning what Wyoming DOT has done, and she raised a number of these concerns in an editorial that's been published here recently. Now, here's another interesting aspect of this article. Geotechnical engineers who spoke with the News and Guide on the condition of anonymity echoed the concerns that Chambers and Casey Jones, the Kansas-based engineer, have been raising about Wyoming DOT's moving forward with a rebuild before completing the stability analysis. Others echoed concerns that McConn raised. Placing too much fill material underneath the bypass could either stress the walls of the curve that failed or put too much pressure on the underlying soil that caused the collapse nearby. At what point of adding more material do you get to the point where you've tipped the stability and made another problem, McConn asked. Without a plan released, it's hard to know, he said. And I agree with that. Now, this is the biggest takeaway from this news article in my view. The department has not yet formally calculated a factor of safety for the temporary bypass. That's a number that expresses how much stronger a system is than what it needs to be for an intended load. And it says that the Wyoming DOT state geologist would release a diagram outlining plans for the bypass. It wasn't available at the time that this article was released. Well, let's talk about what the factor of safety is and why it's important. And I'll show you some step-by-step procedures for how this is done and what it means. But let's finish up with a few of these remaining quotes. It says, last fall, road crews paved over that spot to make it smoother for motorists and plow drivers. When they did, they also installed an inclinometer in the big fill, a device that helps detect soil movement. In mid-May, the department read the device and saw that the slope had moved very little, Hammond said. That's what it's been doing for 20 plus years, Hammond said. It really wasn't that big of a deal. All right, well, that's some news. I haven't heard previously that they had any instrumentation out there to monitor the slope. So again, as you saw from my list of questions, did they not have the inclinometer casing in the appropriate location? Did it go deep enough? Were they reading it on a frequent enough basis? Were they understanding the data results in terms of incipient slope movement to lead to a catastrophic failure of the embankment that occurred here recently? So continues here with the article. Wyoming DOT determines the bypass is on stable terrain by looking at geologic maps, physical observations on the ground, and drilling the subsurface. The department's geologists have determined both that the soil under the bypass is similar to the soil under the big fill, that's the section that failed, and that failure isn't a risk under the temporary road. Well, again, how do they know? I think what they're doing here is what's called engineering judgment. They don't have enough information, and they're proceeding based on their experience and to the extent of the information that they do have on hand. But again, with the backdrop of them having missed that this slope was going to fail catastrophically, I think leads to reasonable questions about how accurate and reasonable their engineering judgment may be. Now, here's a quote that came from me. "I'm not saying that this is going to fail or what they're doing isn't viable," said Jones, the Kansas engineer. "I'm just saying there's no way they could have addressed the underlying questions to an extent that you would think would be necessary in a situation like this." And I pose this question, is this a matter of risk-taking, or do they have more information that they haven't provided to the public? Again, I think that's a fair question. And just to paraphrase this, Hammond, the Wyoming DOT district engineer, said the analysis is ongoing, and that will inform the full rebuild of the road. So presumably that's not informing the installation of this temporary bypass to the same extent. And then other engineers, including me, have commented that it's important to install new geotechnical instrumentation, such as piezometers and inclinometer casings, and to read them in order to figure out what's going on. And I would suggest doing that before the roadway is reopened to traffic at a bare minimum. We will install instrumentation to monitor that ground from the time it's constructed, and we will monitor it going forward until a permanent solution is designed and put in place, Dayhill said, the Wyoming state geologist. So again, they had, as it's been reported, some instrumentation, or at least one piece of instrumentation, the inclinometer casing in the slope, prior to failure, and it was read a matter of weeks before the catastrophic failure occurred, and apparently the true story wasn't revealed to Wyoming DOT. Now, I've shown this slide before, but let's talk about why geotechnical data is important in these situations and how it's used. So I've shown you this slide of potential shear failure surfaces of an embankment slope. And when you do these types of analysis, you don't just guess as to what you think is the most likely, what they call critical shear surface. You iteratively try different configurations of these potential shear surfaces and look for what they call minimum factors of safety, or the lowest factor of safety. So going to this next slide, the factor of safety is a ratio of the available shear strength along that potential failure surface divided by the driving forces. So you have the self-weight of the soil, you have the effects of groundwater. All these things act to push in the downhill direction due to gravity. So as I mentioned, you iteratively select different trial shear surfaces and you compute the factor of safety. And usually a minimum factor of safety in situations like this is 1.5. So you have 1.5 times more shear strength that's needed for keeping the slope stable as what the forces are trying to push it down the hill. So in order to do that assessment, you have to have a very good understanding of the location of the groundwater and what the material properties are for the soil, both in the embankment fill and the foundation soil. So you need to know the unit weight of the soil, and you need to know the shear strength properties under a range of conditions that's likely to exist during the life of that embankment or the time period that's being used. And as I've mentioned, those types of tests results take time. It takes time to drill the borings. It takes time to take the samples. It takes time to get those samples back to the lab and run a variety of both index, strength, and consolidation tests. And those high-end tests that are really important to properly assess what's going on relative to the computed factor of safety, those can't be rushed. they take a certain amount of time, no matter what you do, and that period of time is days and weeks. So I don't see how they have all the data at hand that they could use to compute the factor of safety for the slope they're building. And according to Bob Hammond, they haven't done that computation, at least so far. Now let's run a few segments from the Wyoming DOT's YouTube site.
Most landslides move slowly, providing ample time to perform mitigation work without disrupting traffic.
Okay, well, they said that, they being Bob Hammond, that there's been movement of this slope in this area for approximately 20 years. And apparently it's increased to some degree over time because they finally put in some instrumentation, at least last year. And I say finally, I don't know if they put in instrumentation in the past and it became non-functioning, because you can have an active area of slide movement, and then if the casing has deflected enough such that you can't pass the probe through the casing to the bottom of where it's anchored, then you have to abandon that casing and install another one. So I don't know the exact history of what instrumentation has been out there, but again, there's been at least one inclinometer that was installed a year ago.
But when a slide quickly and unexpectedly severs the busiest 2-lane highway in the state, a rapid response is critical.
Okay, so as I've heard from previous statements from Wyoming DOT, they got surprised by this catastrophic failure. And it's disturbing to me that they were surprised by it, because the photos I saw pre-catastrophic failure were clear indications of a large slope movement that was ongoing and could likely lead to catastrophic failure. I've seen those types of slopes. I've been around them. I've cautioned people to get off of them when I went out to job sites. So to me, it's a showstopper. You go out there, you see something like that, close the road, get everybody out of here, and let's assess what we've got going on here.
Within hours of the slope failure, plans were being developed for a short-term solution to restore traffic on the route.
We brought all the right people, from geology to engineering and environmental services, along with our partners with the Forest Service and our emergency contractor. And really within a couple of days, we had a design done and already in progress being constructed.
Okay, so now he's saying a couple of days. He was previously quoted as saying that the design of this bypass was completed in a single day on Sunday, June 9th, the day after the catastrophic failure. So as I've pointed out in the most recent video, that's enough time to get a handle on your road alignment and the grades and so on. It's not enough time to assess the geotechnical aspects of what you're doing.
The bypass will be placed uphill of the slide. A tighter curve on a steep 11% grade does not meet design standards for a permanent fix.
Okay, so they said that this bypass is going to have an 11% grade, and other aspects of it don't meet normal design standards.
Plans are in the works for a reconstruction of the road.
Our plan is starting to take shape. There's still a lot of moving parts in that plan, but what we want to do is get traffic back on the original alignment, rebuilding a road there, so it's a lot safer, a lot better for grades and everything else. But really, that's going to take a few months. We want to get it done before the snow flies.
So that goes back to my earlier questions. What kind of restrictions are they going to place on this temporary bypass in terms of size and weight of vehicles? Can a trailer be towed behind a vehicle? When they implement their permanent fix to this slide area, can they do it without closing the roadway, the temporary bypass that is? And can they come up with a plan based on solid data and analysis and implement a permanent repair of this roadway in the short period of time that's left before the winter season sets in? Now, there's another news article that I put a link in the description for, but that's Local News 8 out of Idaho. And they were commenting on Councilwoman Chambers' editorial, where she's raising questions about how Wyoming DOT is proceeding in this situation. And I want to read you this quote from Wyoming DOT Chief Engineer Geologist James Dayhill. Said they've been monitoring the curve along the Big Fill slide for over a year. When asked if the pass failure could have been predicted, Dayhill laughed. I'm not in the business of predicting. I guess those geologists in Jackson might be in the business of predicting stuff, Dayhill said sarcastically. Okay, I guess he doesn't like the word prediction, but if you're responsible or your staff is responsible to go out to a roadway that's experienced cracking, where a motorcyclist had just crashed because of those cracks, it's in an area that you know of it's in an area that you know has been sliding over a period of years, and you see a crack pattern with a depression in the roadway indicative of a large mass of material getting ready to move down slope. So if you do that assessment, is that a prediction? If you say either it will fail or it won't fail, you could consider that a prediction. And I think that's a reasonable thing to be addressing by the Wyoming DOT here in this instance. You could also have a prediction if you say it's probably not going to fail, or if it did fail, it would be after a period of so much time or something like that. These are all valid types of assessments that could be called a prediction. So to mock the notion that they should have had an idea that this whole slope was about ready to cut loose is, I think, rather telling and unfortunate. Now, as I mentioned, they may be in a position where they get this temporary bypass constructed, but they're not going to be able to open up the whole roadway until they get a box culvert constructed a couple miles away where these mud flows had occurred. So the construction of the bypass, they said it's $430,000. I guess they've had some change orders. It's going to go up from there. And the price for the installation of these box culverts is $880,000. And this isn't from this site, but this is what a box culvert looks like. So the idea is if there's any mud flowing down from the hills above the roadway, it could go underneath the roadway through these openings in this box culvert. So I want to thank those of you who have reached out and provided information to me. I really appreciate it, and please continue to do so. Also, I want to send a shout out to the channel members. I really appreciate your ongoing support. I'd also like to thank those of you who have provided super thanks. That's another way to support the channel. So stay tuned. I've got a variety of other videos coming up here, and I will continue to follow the Teton Pass saga. So check out the description for links to key things that I've cited here. Also, there's a free digital download for the top civil engineering disasters from the past 100 years. I've also got a new digital download that I'm getting ready to release, and I'll update the description with that link. And while you're down there, if you haven't done so already, please hit those like, subscribe, and notification buttons. Thanks very much, everyone.